Now we're going to start discussing ecosystems diversity and hotspots. Ecosystems diversity or ecological diversity assesses the richness and complexity of a biological community, including the number of niches, trophic levels, and ecological processes that capture energy, sustain food webs, and recycle materials within this system. This concept is relatively new, but scientific knowledge at the ecosystem level is now recognized as a critical part of understanding total biodiversity on Earth. So we usually describe an ecosystem in terms of the climate or the habitat, and also the distribution on the Earth, right? So we can already identify some key ecosystems that are also recognized as biomes because they are distributed all over the world. We recognize rainforests, arid grasslands, deserts, etc. Now we're going to describe these ecosystems, in terms of diversity. And also we're going to describe the processes within each ecosystem. Something interesting about biodiversity is that it is greatest closest to the equator, and it decreases when we move towards the north and the south poles. And this is connected to the climate, right? The role of the seasons on these areas that are away from the equator is that the organisms will be adapted to multiple conditions. Ecosystems can have a very similar looking, but then we're going to see that there are key difference on the ecosystem, or maybe difference on the organisms that do those functions. So for instance, high diversity among types of ecosystems means that there will be also a high diversity of species themselves. Each species is specialized to a type of ecosystem in a particular place. As such, ecosystems distributed in different parts of the world, but with the same classification, for example, we're going to have the example of coral reefs, may have different species, but overall, they can perform the same processes on the ecosystem. All right? So this means that we can have a specific type of fish in one of the coral reef in Australia that performs the functions that are carried out by other fish, other type of fish in the Caribbean coral reef. So now that we have talked about the distribution of species or the abundance of species in ecosystems, we can ask ourselves two key questions. One, which ones do we have to protect if they have different functions? So we cannot say protect only the Australian coral reef over the Caribbean coral reef, because there might be some important functions that needs to be protected as well, right? In different coral environments. But also the second key aspect that we have to look at is how many species are there in total, right? This is also connected to the protection or the conservation strategies, right? So at the end of the great exploration era of the 19th century, some scientists were confident that they will know, or they will find, all the living things on Earth and will be able to name them. Recent studies have proved that this is actually too far from reality, and we don't know. We know just a small percentage of the overall total species in the world, and we know that over or around 1.7 million species are known. The figure presented is the most updated one from the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. It is from 2021, and it shows it is defined, classified by species, and it have different type of groups, and from that we can see the number extinct in the wild, critically endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, data deficient, and least concern. And what we can see is that there is a big kind of disproportion on the number of species that we know in respect to probably the number of species that have been classified as threatened species. And the other aspect that we need to consider is how many species are being lost without having been discovered yet. Now that we have discussed the number of species that we know and also the importance on the ecosystems, we're going to come up with a key important concept for conservation that is called hotspots. Biodiversity hotspots are locations with many endemic native species that are highly threatened. And this concept was introduced by the scientist Norman Myers and then widely recognized by the scientific community. It is important to note that to declare an area as hotspot, there are some criteria that needs to be met. First, there has to be a significant amount of endemic species, and that these species only exist in that specific region. And there has to be more than 70% of the original habitat already lost, which means that it is threatened, right? So then that's why we need to conserve, right? At the moment, there are 36 recognized biodiversity hotspots. The interesting thing about this is that less than 3% of the Earth's land surface area is represented by these hotspots. The hotspot area is much more than a conservation tool. It's also, it can be a scientific tool to measure the pressure on biodiversity, because this can be seen as labs where you can see the effects on losing biodiversity. There are, for instance, this can serve as an example to protect other areas that cannot be considered as hotspots, probably because they don't meet the criteria of 1,500 endemic species of plants and more than 70% of the original habitat lost. And yet, they may be important or worth to be preserved. Here we present a map on biodiversity hotspots. And we can see that the hotspots also account for about half of all known higher plant species and 42% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. What we can see in the map is that the hottest of these hotspots tend to be tropical islands, such as Madagascar, Indonesia, and the Philippines, where geographic isolation has resulted in large numbers of unique plants and animals. Special climatic conditions, such as those found in South Africa, California, and the Mediterranean basin, also produce highly distinctive flora and fauna. Now let's talk about Australia. Australia is very unique in terms of species diversity. There are over 1,300 of endemic vertebrate species, and it's actually the one with the highest number of these endemic species of vertebrate species. As such, there are many sites declared as hotspots, especially in Western Australia. But we also have a lot of hotspots in Queensland region and New South Wales. And what is important for you to reflect is what are the implications of having hotspots or having regions, ecosystems that are so important in your engineering profession.